When your country runs out of money, when the currency collapses, when your government can no longer pay for food imports or fuel, there is one place left to turn: the International Monetary Fund, the IMF. It presents itself as the world's financial firefighter, the institution that rushes in to save economies from total collapse. But here's what they do not tell you. Not every country that asks for help gets it. And among those that do, the conditions imposed vary wildly. Some nations receive gentle terms, extended timelines, room to breathe. Others face brutal demands that crush their economies further. The difference is not about economics. It is about power. It is about who decides behind closed doors which countries are allowed to crash and which must be saved. And those decisions follow rules you have never seen written down anywhere. The IMF was born in 1945 in the aftermath of the Second World War. The world's major powers gathered at Bretton Woods, a resort in New Hampshire, to redesign the global financial system. They created two institutions: the World Bank, meant to fund development, and the IMF, meant to stabilize currencies and manage balance of payments crises. The idea sounded noble. Countries would contribute funds to a common pool. When one faced financial trouble, it could borrow from that pool to get back on its feet. In exchange, the troubled country would implement policies to fix its problems. Everyone would benefit from global economic stability. That was the theory. The reality has been very different. From the beginning, the IMF was not built as a democratic institution. It was built on a quota system. Each member country contributes money based roughly on the size of its economy. Your quota determines how much you can borrow, but also, critically, how much voting power you have. The bigger your economy, the more money you contribute, the more power you wield. The United States, as the largest contributor, holds 17% of the voting power. That might not sound like much until you understand how decisions are made. Most major decisions require an 85% supermajority, which means the United States, with just 17%, has veto power over any significant change. Europe collectively holds around 30%. Add the United States and Europe together, and you have close to half the voting power controlled by wealthy Western nations, even though they represent a fraction of the world's population and increasingly a smaller share of global economic output. China, despite being the world's second largest economy, holds only 6% of voting power. India, with over 1 billion people, holds less than 3%. The entire continent of Africa, with 54 countries and well over 1 billion people, collectively holds less voting power than France. This is not an accident. This is by design. The IMF was created by the winners of World War II to serve their interests. And while the institution has evolved, expanded, taken on new missions and new members, that fundamental power structure remains largely intact. Now, let's talk about what happens when a country needs help. A financial crisis hits. Currency collapses, foreign reserves evaporate, the government cannot afford to import essentials, panic spreads, the country approaches the IMF. What happens next is a negotiation, but it is a negotiation between unequal parties. The country is desperate. The IMF has what it needs, and the IMF comes with a checklist, a set of conditions the country must accept before receiving a single dollar. These conditions are called conditionality. And while the IMF publishes general guidelines about conditionality, claiming it must be tailored to each country's circumstances, the reality on the ground tells a different story. The conditions tend to follow a pattern: fiscal austerity, cut government spending, balance the budget; monetary tightening, raise interest rates to stabilize the currency and control inflation; structural reforms, privatize state-owned enterprises, remove subsidies, liberalize trade, deregulate markets, make labor markets more flexible; currency devaluation, let your currency fall to its market level; tax increases, especially regressive taxes like sales taxes that hit ordinary people hardest. The IMF calls this structural adjustment. Critics call it something else. They call it the Washington Consensus, a term coined in 1989 to describe the policy package pushed by Washington-based institutions. The IMF The World Bank, the U.S. Treasury Department, stabilize, liberalize, privatize, repeat in country after country. The playbook barely changes. One dose, fast, no matter the patient's condition. Here is where it gets interesting. These policies, in theory, should stabilize economies, reduce deficits, control inflation, restore investor confidence. Sometimes they work, at least partially, but often they make things worse, much worse. And this is where the hidden rules come into play. Because when things go wrong, when a country follows the IMF's prescriptions and still suffers, the response depends not on economics, but on politics. Let's look at some examples. In 1997, financial crisis swept across East Asia. It started in Thailand on July 2nd, when the government was forced to float the baht after months of defending an unrealistic currency peg. Speculators had seen Thailand's weaknesses, growing deficits, excessive borrowing, and overheated property market. They bet against the baht. The Thai government spent billions trying to defend the currency. When reserves ran dry, they gave up. The baht collapsed, losing 30% of its value almost overnight. The crisis spread instantly. Indonesia, South Korea, Malaysia, the Philippines. These were economies that had been celebrated as the Asian tigers, models of rapid development. Suddenly, they were in free fall. The IMF stepped in with massive rescue packages, $17 billion for Thailand, $40 billion for Indonesia, $57 billion for South Korea. These were the largest bailouts in IMF history at that time. But the money came with conditions. Thailand was told to close dozens of financial institutions immediately, raise interest rates sharply, cut government spending. The theory was this would restore confidence. The result was the opposite. Businesses collapsed, unemployment soared, the economy contracted by over 10%. But Thailand followed the rules. Indonesia got even harsher treatment. The IMF demanded the closure of 16 banks, removal of food and fuel subsidies, massive spending cuts. Interest rates spiked to 65% at one point. The currency, the rupiah, lost 80% of its value. Riots broke out. Food prices soared. The government fell. President Suharto, who had ruled for 32 years, was forced to resign in May 1998. The economy contracted by over 13%. Poverty rates exploded. Millions lost their jobs, their savings, their hope. South Korea faced similar demands: high interest rates, tight fiscal policy, forced restructuring of major conglomerates. But here is what is interesting. South Korea did not fully follow the IMF script. The government resisted some demands. It maintained certain controls. It supported strategic industries. The Korean people accepted painful reforms, but the government retained more control over the pace and nature of change. South Korea recovered relatively quickly, much faster than Indonesia. By 2000, Korean incomes exceeded pre-crisis levels. Thailand took until 2002, Indonesia until 2005. The country that followed IMF prescriptions most faithfully took the longest to recover. Critics noticed. Nobel Prize-winning economist Joseph Stiglitz, who was chief economist at the World Bank during the crisis, was scathing. He argued the IMF treated the Asian crisis like a typical developing country fiscal crisis when it was actually a private sector debt crisis driven by capital flight and panic. The IMF's demand for high interest rates and austerity deepened the recession, destroyed businesses, and turned a liquidity problem into a solvency crisis. Stiglitz pointed out the contradiction. The IMF preached free markets, but stepped in to bail out international creditors, socializing losses while privatizing gains. Now let's jump to Argentina. In the 1990s, Argentina was the IMF's poster child. The government implemented nearly every Washington consensus policy. It privatized state industries. It opened markets. It pegged the peso 1-to-1 with the dollar to kill hyperinflation. Foreign investment poured in. Growth was strong. The IMF praised Argentina as a model of reform. But underneath, problems grew. The currency peg made Argentine exports expensive. The trade deficit widened. Provinces spent recklessly. Debt accumulated. When neighboring Brazil devalued its currency in 1999, Argentine exports became even less competitive. Recession set in. The IMF kept lending. Between 2000 and 2001, the IMF provided over $22 billion in multiple tranches, trying to prevent default. Each time, Argentina agreed to harsher austerity, cut spending, raise taxes, maintain the currency peg. But the economy kept contracting, unemployment soared. By late 2001, people had lost faith. Bank runs began. The government froze bank accounts, limiting withdrawals to $250 per week. This measure, called the Corralito, sparked fury. Riots erupted across Buenos Aires. People banged pots and pans in the streets. The president resigned. His replacement lasted a week. Another took over. In December 2001, the IMF refused to release the next tranche of funding. Argentina had missed its deficit targets. Without IMF money, the government could not pay debts. On December 23, Argentina defaulted on roughly $100 billion in debt, the largest sovereign default in history at that time. The economy collapsed. GDP fell by over 10% in a single year. Unemployment hit 25%. Poverty soared past 50%. The middle class was devastated. This was not a crisis. This was a social catastrophe. And the IMF, which had financed and supervised Argentina's policies for years, walked away. The institution later admitted errors. An independent evaluation in 2004 acknowledged the IMF had continued lending when it should have stopped, had failed to recognize debt was unsustainable, had demanded excessive austerity that worsened the crisis. But here is the crucial question. Why did the IMF keep lending to Argentina when the policies were clearly failing? Was it because Argentina had been such a faithful follower of Washington consensus policies? Was it because defaulting would hurt Western creditors? Was it because admitting failure would damage the IMF's reputation? Whatever the reason, Argentina was allowed to collapse slowly, painfully, over multiple years, with the IMF providing just enough money to keep servicing foreign debt, but not enough to prevent economic destruction. And when the final collapse came, the IMF simply stopped lending and blamed Argentina for not implementing reforms aggressively enough. Compare that to the treatment of Greece in 2010. When Greece revealed its budget deficit was far larger than reported, threatening Eurozone stability, the IMF joined European institutions in a massive bailout, 110 billion euros in the first package. Eventually, bailouts totaled nearly 300 billion euros. This made Greece the largest borrower in IMF history. The conditions imposed were severe: pension cuts, wage cuts, tax increases, privatization of public assets. Greece was told to run massive budget surpluses for decades. Austerity crushed the economy. GDP fell by over 25% from peak to trough. Unemployment exceeded 25%. Youth unemployment hit 60%. Thousands of businesses closed. Skilled workers fled abroad. Suicide rates spiked. But here's what happened differently. The IMF kept lending, even when it became obvious Greece could not repay, even when the IMF's own internal analyses showed the debt was unsustainable. The money kept flowing. Why? Because Greece was in the Eurozone. A Greek default threatened contagion, threatened to spread panic to Portugal, Spain, Italy, potentially unraveling the entire European monetary union. The IMF was saving not just Greece, but the Euro and European banks that held Greek debt. The bailout money went primarily to pay off private creditors. Greek citizens got austerity. Foreign banks got paid. Eventually, in 2012, private creditors took a haircut, accepting losses on Greek bonds. But it came late, after years of austerity had already destroyed the economy. And even then, European governments refused to take losses on their loans. They restructured, extended maturities, lowered interest rates, but insisted on repayment. The IMF, normally insistent on debt restructuring when sustainability is questionable, accepted this political compromise. Greece remained in the euro, but at tremendous cost. An entire generation sacrificed. Here is the pattern emerging. When a crisis threatens systemically important countries or regions, when it threatens major creditor nations, the IMF bends its rules. It lends far beyond normal limits. It delays insisting on debt restructuring. It accepts slower reforms. Political considerations override economic logic. The institution becomes a mechanism to protect creditor interests and prevent contagion, whatever the cost to the borrowing country's citizens. Now let's look at more recent examples. Sri Lanka, a nation of 22 million people, defaulted on its foreign debt in April 2022. The country had run out of foreign reserves. It could not afford to import fuel or food. Power cuts lasted hours every day. Hospitals ran out of medicine. People queued for days to get gasoline. Inflation hit 70%. Fury exploded into mass protests. Hundreds of thousands stormed government buildings. The president fled the country and resigned. It was the first default in Sri Lankan history. The causes were complex. COVID killed tourism. Commodity prices spiked after Russia invaded Ukraine. Debt had accumulated through poorly planned infrastructure projects. Tax cuts in 2019 slashed government revenue. Reserves dwindled. When the crisis hit, it hit hard. Sri Lanka approached the IMF for its 17th bailout. Negotiations dragged on for months. The IMF demanded Sri Lanka first reach agreement with all major creditors on debt restructuring. That included China, Sri Lanka's largest bilateral lender. China delayed, insisting on terms that preserved its loans. The IMF would not finalize the program until China agreed. Finally, in March 2023, the IMF approved a $3 billion program over 4 years. The conditions were harsh. Income taxes were raised sharply, hitting middle-class families hard. Electricity tariffs increased 66%. Value-added tax jumped from 8% to 15%, with plans to remove most exemptions. Food and fuel subsidies were slashed. The government was told to privatize state enterprises and tighten monetary policy. The IMF justified these measures as necessary to restore fiscal sustainability. But the human cost was brutal. Half of Sri Lankan families reported cutting meals to afford food. Malnutrition among children increased. Healthcare deteriorated. Education budgets were slashed. And here is the critical detail. The IMF's conditions focused heavily on increasing taxes, especially regressive taxes that hit ordinary people. Meanwhile, plans to tax the wealthy or crack down on elite tax evasion received less emphasis. Why? Because the IMF's primary concern was not equity, but ensuring the government could service debt, including debt to bilateral and multilateral creditors. Pakistan tells a similar story. Pakistan has gone to the IMF 25 times since 1950, more than any other country. The latest bailout, approved in 2024, was for $7 billion. Pakistan's economy had nearly collapsed. Inflation hit 38%. Reserves fell below $3 billion. The government struggled to pay for imports. Pakistan secured a $3 billion program in 2023 that stabilized things temporarily. But the new $7 billion program came with familiar conditions. Raise taxes, cut subsidies, privatize state enterprises, maintain tight monetary policy, let the currency float. The Pakistani rupee collapsed against the dollar after controls were removed. Ordinary Pakistanis saw their purchasing power evaporate. The cost of living soared. Political tensions simmered. Here is what stands out. Pakistan has been in almost continuous IMF programs since the 1980s. Each time the conditions are similar. Each time, Pakistan implements some reforms, then backslides. Subsidies creep back. Spending increases. Tax collection remains weak. Powerful interests, including the military, which consumes over $10 billion annually, remain largely exempt from austerity. The elite avoid taxes. The burden falls on the middle class and poor. And the IMF keeps lending over and over because Pakistan's collapse would destabilize South Asia, because Pakistan is a nuclear power, because geopolitical considerations override economic logic. Compare these cases to countries that do not get rescued. When Lebanon's financial system collapsed starting in 2019, spiraling into one of the worst economic crises in modern history, the IMF offered little. Lebanon requested assistance. The IMF sent missions. But years passed with no program approved. Why? Because Lebanon could not reach consensus on reforms. Its political system, divided among sectarian factions, was paralyzed. The elite refused to accept losses. The IMF insisted on conditions that threatened powerful interests. No agreement could be reached. So Lebanon was left to collapse. Its currency lost over 90% of its value. Banks froze deposits, savings evaporated, poverty exploded, electricity and water became scarce, medicines disappeared. The country descended into chaos while the IMF watched. The lesson is clear. The IMF does not rescue countries based purely on need or on the severity of crisis. It intervenes when it aligns with the interests of major shareholders, when contagion threatens, when geopolitical stability is at stake. Countries that matter get bailouts. Countries that do not, or countries whose elites refuse to play along, are abandoned. Now let's talk about the structure of conditionality itself. The IMF claims conditions are tailored to each country. In practice, they follow a template. The institution has certain core beliefs baked into its institutional culture. Fiscal deficits are dangerous. Inflation must be controlled. Markets should be free. Government intervention distorts economies. These beliefs shape every program. And while the IMF has published reviews admitting past mistakes, acknowledging that austerity can deepen recessions, that capital controls can be useful, that inequality matters, the core approach changes slowly. Programs still routinely demand spending cuts during recessions. They still prioritize creditor repayment over social spending. They still push privatization even when it benefits foreign investors more than local populations. Conditionality takes several forms. Quantitative performance criteria are hard targets. Budget deficit limits, inflation ceilings, reserve floors. Miss these and the IMF stops dispersing funds. Structural benchmarks are policy actions. Pass a law privatizing state assets. Eliminate a subsidy. Reform the tax code. These are supposed to be flexible, but in practice, missing them delays reviews. Indicative targets are softer goals but still monitored. Prior actions are reforms that must be completed before the program even begins as a sign of commitment. The cumulative effect is a detailed policy straitjacket. Governments lose control over core economic decisions. Sovereignty erodes. And when things go wrong, when following IMF prescriptions leads to deeper recession, higher unemployment, social unrest, the IMF blames inadequate implementation, political resistance, external shocks, never the policies themselves. Joseph Stiglitz has been one of the most prominent critics. As chief economist of the World Bank from 1997 to 2000, and before that chair of President Clinton's Council of Economic Advisers, Stiglitz had a front-row seat. He watched the IMF's response to the Asian crisis. He watched Russia's catastrophic transition from communism. He watched Argentina's collapse, and he concluded the IMF operates on ideology, not evidence. In his book Globalization and Its Discontents, published in 2002, Stiglitz systematically dismantled the Washington Consensus. He argued the IMF's faith in free markets ignored decades of economic research showing markets fail when information is asymmetric, when institutions are weak, when inequality is high. He argued high interest rates, demanded by the IMF to stabilize currencies, destroyed businesses, and made crises worse. He argued capital market liberalization, pushed as a core reform, made developing countries vulnerable to destabilizing speculative flows. He argued privatization, done hastily without proper regulation, created corrupt monopolies instead of efficient markets. Stiglitz pointed out a fundamental contradiction. The IMF preached market discipline, but intervened to bail out investors, shielding them from the consequences of bad bets. When crises hit, ordinary workers lost jobs, saw wages cut, faced collapsing social services. But foreign creditors often got repaid in full with IMF money. The losses were socialized. The gains remained private. This was not a market system. This was a system rigged to benefit capital at the expense of labor. The response from the IMF and its defenders was fierce. They accused Stiglitz of being naive, of not understanding the realities of crisis management, of oversimplifying complex situations. But Stiglitz was not alone. Many respected economists echoed his critiques. Paul Krugman argued for capital controls during the Asian crisis. Danny Roderick documented how successful developing countries like China and South Korea succeeded precisely by ignoring Washington Consensus policies. Even the IMF's own independent evaluation office issued damning reports acknowledging failures in Argentina in the Eurozone programs in structural conditionality. But here is the uncomfortable truth. The IMF is not really designed to be reformed. Its governance structure ensures dominant shareholders control decisions. Emerging markets and developing countries, which make up most of IMF borrowers, have little voice. They can complain. They can document harms. But they cannot change policies without approval from the United States and Europe. And those major shareholders have their own interests. They want creditors protected. They want markets open to their companies. They want ideological alignment on free market principles. The IMF serves these interests. It is not a neutral technocratic institution. It is a political institution that advances certain interests over others. Consider the issue of debt restructuring. When a country cannot repay its debts, the rational economic solution is restructuring. Write down some debt, extend maturities, reduce interest rates, give the country breathing room to recover. The longer you delay restructuring, the worse things get. More austerity, deeper recession, more suffering, eventually an even bigger default. Yet the IMF repeatedly delays pushing for restructuring. Why? Because major shareholders often hold that debt, directly or through their banks. Restructuring means losses for creditors, so the IMF lends money to allow the country to keep paying creditors, imposing austerity to free up resources for debt service, until the situation becomes unsustainable and a massive default occurs anyway. This happened in Argentina. It happened in Greece. It is happening elsewhere. The pattern repeats. There is also the question of differential treatment based on who you are. When Iceland's banking system collapsed in 2008, triggering the largest banking crisis relative to an economy's size in history, the country initially faced severe IMF pressure for austerity. But Iceland, a small, wealthy democracy with an educated population and strong institutions, was able to push back. It let its banks fail. It imposed capital controls. It protected social spending. The IMF eventually accepted a program that gave Iceland space. Iceland recovered relatively quickly and repaid the IMF ahead of schedule. Would a developing country have gotten the same flexibility? Unlikely. When Ireland faced a banking crisis around the same time, also a wealthy European nation, it received more than 22 billion euros in IMF and European assistance, with conditions far less harsh than Greece would later face. Institutional strength, political connections, and wealth matter. The structure of voting power also means certain regions have more voice. European countries, despite coordinating their positions through the European Union, maintain separate seats at the IMF. They collectively control nearly 30% of votes. This allows them to protect each other. When the Eurozone debt crisis hit, the IMF became deeply involved in programs for Greece, Ireland, Portugal, Cyprus. Critics noted the IMF bent its own rules. It lent exceptionally large amounts relative to a country's quota. It continued lending despite doubts about debt sustainability. It accepted slower reforms. Why? Because these were European countries. Because the IMF's major European shareholders demanded it. Because protecting the euro was a political priority. Developing countries facing similar crises do not get such leniency. The IMF has made some reforms. After the Asian crisis, it created new lending facilities designed to provide support with fewer conditions for countries with strong policies. The idea was to reduce stigma and offer precautionary support before crises hit. Take-up has been limited. Most countries avoid the IMF until they have no choice. The institution's reputation for harsh conditionality precedes it. In 2010, the IMF completed a major quota reform that increased emerging market voting shares. China's quota increased significantly. Still, the United States retained veto power. Europe still holds disproportionate sway, and the managing director by informal agreement is always European, while the World Bank president is always American. Power remains concentrated. Meanwhile, alternatives have emerged. China created the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. It provides financing without Western-dominated conditionality. The BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, established their own new development bank and contingent reserve arrangement, designed explicitly as alternatives to Bretton Woods institutions. Regional arrangements have strengthened. Countries swap currency reserves bilaterally to avoid needing IMF assistance. The global financial architecture is slowly shifting. The IMF remains powerful but no longer unchallenged, and its relevance depends on maintaining legitimacy, which requires outcomes that benefit borrowers, not just creditors. Yet, the patterns persist. When Argentina defaulted again in 2020, the IMF was heavily exposed. It had lent $57 billion in 2018, the largest loan in IMF history, to support a struggling government. The money funded capital flight and debt repayment, not productive investment. The economy contracted, inflation soared, social conditions worsened. In 2020, COVID pushed Argentina into default. The IMF was left holding the bag. In 2022, Argentina negotiated a new program to restructure the existing debt. The conditions remain contentious. This is now Argentina's 22nd IMF program. The definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over, expecting different results. Yet, the cycle continues. The IMF lends. Argentina agrees to reforms. Implementation falters. Crisis returns. Repeat. There's a broader pattern here about moral hazard. If countries know the IMF will bail them out, do they take excessive risks? If creditors know the IMF will ensure repayment, do they lend recklessly? Standard economics says yes, moral hazard exists. The IMF's existence encourages behavior that makes crises more likely. But the alternative, letting countries collapse without support, also has costs. Financial panic spread, trade collapses, people suffer. There are no easy answers. What is clear is the current system privatizes gains and socializes losses. Banks profit during booms. Taxpayers, both in borrowing countries through austerity and in lending countries through IMF contributions, absorb losses during busts. The wealthy and powerful find ways to protect their assets. Ordinary people bear the brunt. Let's zoom out and ask the fundamental question. Who decides which countries are allowed to crash? The answer is not written in any manual. It is determined through a political process within the IMF Executive Board, where votes are weighted by quota, where the largest shareholders have disproportionate influence, where decisions reflect not just economics, but geopolitics, strategic considerations, domestic political pressures in lending countries. The United States, controlling 17% of votes and holding veto power over major decisions, has enormous influence. The U.S. Treasury Department coordinates with the Federal Reserve, with the State Department, to guide IMF policy. When the U.S. wants a country supported, support happens. When the U.S. is indifferent or opposed, support becomes difficult. European countries, acting collectively, wield similar power. They push for outcomes that serve European interests. Developing countries, comprising most IMF members and nearly all borrowers, have limited voice. They can request programs, they can negotiate conditions, but if major shareholders oppose, programs do not get approved or face unacceptable terms. The institution operates through consensus, but consensus is shaped by power, and power flows from wealth. So when we ask who decides which countries crash, the answer is the wealthy countries decide. They decide based on their interests. Economic stability, yes, but also geopolitical advantage, protection of their investors, promotion of their ideological preferences. This is not conspiracy theory. It is institutional design. The IMF was created by powerful countries to serve their purposes. It has evolved, but the core logic remains. The institution channels resources from wealthy countries to troubled countries, imposing conditions that open markets and protect creditors. This serves lenders' interests. Sometimes it serves borrowers too, when programs are well designed and when conditions align with genuine reform needs. But often it serves only lenders. Borrowers suffer. And because the institution operates with limited transparency, because key negotiations happen behind closed doors, because conditionality letters are released only after agreements are signed, the public rarely sees how decisions are really made. There are documents, letters of intent, memoranda of understanding, staff reports. These become public eventually. But the real negotiations, the horse trading over which conditions will be imposed, which targets will be set, how much flexibility exists, those discussions happen in private. Country representatives meet with IMF staff and executive directors in Washington. Pressure is applied, concessions are extracted, governments desperate for money have little bargaining power. They accept what they must, and when they return home, they present IMF conditions as unavoidable, as technical requirements imposed by faceless bureaucrats. This serves a purpose. It allows governments to implement unpopular policies, cutting pensions, raising taxes, eliminating subsidies, and blame the IMF. The IMF accepts this role, becoming a scapegoat because it allows reforms to proceed that might otherwise face insurmountable political opposition. But here is the cost. Sovereignty erodes, democracy is undermined, citizens vote for Aurora. Governments that promise certain policies, those governments under IMF programs implement opposite policies. Elections feel meaningless, people lose faith in democratic institutions, populist backlash grows. We have seen this repeatedly. In Greece, voters elected governments that promised to reject austerity. Those governments, once in power, signed new agreements accepting more austerity because the alternative was exit from the euro and economic chaos. Democracy was suspended. Similarly in Latin America, where decades of IMF programs bred deep resentment, left-wing governments rose to power promising to break with Washington consensus policies. Some succeeded by avoiding the IMF entirely. Others, like Argentina under the Kirchners, repaid the IMF entirely in 2006 to escape conditionality. Venezuela went further, rejecting international financial institutions altogether. The backlash has been profound, and while many factors drive anti-globalization sentiment, the feeling that international institutions impose policies that hurt ordinary people while benefiting elites is a major cause. Let's return to the question of whether IMF programs actually work. Do they achieve their stated goals? The evidence is mixed at best. The IMF's own evaluations acknowledge high failure rates. Programs often miss growth targets. Budget deficits frequently overshoot projections. Debt sustainability remains elusive. A study covering 1980 to 2014 found IMF programs in conditionality had no significant effect on export diversification or economic complexity, measures of structural transformation. Another study found IMF programs associated with worse poverty outcomes during economic downturns. Countries under IMF programs saw the poor benefit less from growth and suffer more during contractions. Research on growth effects shows inconsistent results. Some programs correlate with faster recovery, many do not. Context matters enormously. Programs imposed during deep recessions, demanding austerity when private demand is collapsing, reliably worsen outcomes. Programs that provide financing without excessive conditionality, allowing governments to maintain spending and cushion the social impact, tend to work better. But the IMF has been slow to learn these lessons. Why the persistence of failed approaches? Institutional inertia plays a role. The IMF employs thousands of economists trained in similar frameworks, sharing common assumptions. These assumptions, faith in market efficiency, skepticism of government, belief that austerity restores confidence, are hard to dislodge. Academic research showing these assumptions are flawed filters slowly into policy. The IMF structure, where management and staff design programs but the executive board approves them, creates accountability problems. Staff face pressure to design programs major shareholders will approve. This means incorporating creditor-friendly conditions even if economically dubious. It means prioritizing debt repayment over social spending. It means avoiding policies major shareholders oppose, like capital controls or wealth taxes or debt restructuring. Innovation is difficult when powerful interests benefit from the status quo. There is also the question of what success means. If the goal is restoring market access and ensuring debt repayment, many programs succeed. Countries regain the ability to borrow internationally. Creditors get repaid. From that perspective, programs work. But if the goal is sustainable development, poverty reduction, or building resilient economies, The record is poor. Countries cycle through repeated programs. Pakistan's 25 programs, Argentina's 22. Jamaica has had multiple programs spanning decades. The same countries return over and over. This suggests the programs address symptoms, providing short-term financing without fixing underlying problems. Structural issues, weak institutions, corrupt elites, narrow export bases, dependence on commodity prices, these persist. The IMF focuses on macroeconomic variables, deficits, inflation, exchange rates. It pays less attention to institution building, to industrial policy, to reducing inequality, to political economy. Yet these deeper factors determine long-run outcomes. Consider the contrast with East Asia's successful developers, South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore. These countries grew rapidly, achieving high-income status through heavy government intervention. Industrial policy targeted strategic sectors. State-owned enterprises played key roles. Capital controls prevented destabilizing outflows. Trade protection nurtured infant industries. None of this aligns with Washington consensus prescriptions. Yet, it worked. The IMF would have opposed these policies if consulted. In fact, when South Korea faced crisis in 1997, the IMF demanded dismantling the very structures that enabled its growth. Fortunately, Korea resisted some demands and recovered quickly. The lesson is, there are multiple paths to development. The IMF's path is not the only one. Often it is not the best one. But the institution's power means it can impose a particular vision on desperate countries unable to refuse. What would better IMF governance look like? First, more democratic voting structures, increase representation for developing countries, reduce Europe's disproportionate voice, end the informal arrangement reserving the managing director position for Europeans. Second, greater transparency. Publish negotiation details. Allow public scrutiny of conditionality before it is finalized. Make the basis for lending decisions explicit. Third, shift away from one-size-fits-all conditionality toward genuine tailoring. Recognize different countries face different challenges. Stop imposing austerity during recessions. Allow capital controls when appropriate. Support industrial policy where it makes sense. Fourth, prioritize social protection. Stop demanding cuts to health, education, and safety nets. Instead, require taxes on wealth and elites who often escape burden. Fifth, embrace debt restructuring earlier. When debt is clearly unsustainable, restructure immediately rather than lending to delay the inevitable. Sixth, address political economy. Work with borrowers to build coalitions for reform. Do not impose policies that lack domestic support, then blame failure on weak political will. None of these reforms will happen without pressure. Major shareholders like the current system. It serves their interests. Change requires mobilization by developing countries, civil society, academics, media, ordinary people who bear the costs of failed policies. Some progress has occurred. The IMF acknowledges past mistakes more openly than before. It discusses inequality and social impacts. It has accepted capital controls in some cases, but core issues remain. The power structure is unchanged. Conditionality, though perhaps lighter than in the 1980s and 90s, still constrains sovereignty. The institution still prioritizes creditors, and the cycle of crisis, bailout, austerity, suffering, repeat continues. Looking forward, the global economy faces new challenges. Climate change will disrupt economies, displace populations, strain resources. The transition away from fossil fuels will require massive investment. Pandemic risk remains. Technological change accelerates. Inequality within and between countries grows. The IMF's role in navigating these challenges is uncertain. Will it support climate adaptation and green transitions? Or will it demand austerity that prevents necessary spending? Will it help countries build resilience? Or will it impose policies that increase vulnerability? The answers depend on whether the institution can evolve beyond its outdated ideology and power structure. So far, the signs are not encouraging. What can individuals do? First, understand that these issues affect you. IMF policies shape the global economy, which shapes your opportunities, your job prospects, the stability of the world around you. Second, demand accountability. When your government participates in IMF decisions, ask what they are supporting. push for transparency. Third, support organizations that monitor and critique international financial institutions. Fourth, connect these issues to domestic politics. The same ideologies that drive IMF conditionality, austerity, privatization, deregulation often drive domestic policy. Resisting them anywhere helps resist them everywhere. The hidden rules that determine which countries are allowed to crash come down to power. Who has it? Who wields it? Who benefits? The IMF does not operate on neutral technical principles. It operates as a political institution, advancing the interests of its most powerful members. Sometimes those interests align with genuine crisis resolution and economic development. Often they do not. When they do not, countries suffer. People lose jobs, savings disappear, health and education deteriorate, futures narrow. All while the IMF insists the medicine is working, implementation just needs improvement. Next time will be different. But here's the thing about power. It is not static. It shifts. The rise of China, India, Brazil, other emerging economies is already changing dynamics. Alternative institutions are emerging. The willingness to accept Western-dominated economic architecture is declining. The IMF's future relevance depends on whether it can adapt, whether it can become more representative, more flexible, more willing to learn from failure. Otherwise, it risks becoming irrelevant, bypassed by countries that seek alternatives. That would not necessarily be bad. Competition among international institutions could produce better outcomes, or it could fragment the global economy, reduce cooperation, increase instability. The answer depends on what replaces IMF dominance. For now, the system persists. When the next crisis hits, and it will, the IMF will be there, offering money, demanding conditions, protecting some, abandoning others. The decisions will be made behind closed doors by people you have never heard of, representing governments you did not elect, following rules you cannot see. That is how the system works. Unless enough people understand it, critique it, demand change. So if you found this valuable, share it, talk about it, make these hidden dynamics visible, because sunlight is the best disinfectant, and institutions that operate in shadow fear exposure most. If you made it this far, let me know in the comments what you think about how international finance really operates. Are these institutions serving the interests they claim to serve? What would you change? And if you learned something, subscribe so we can keep pulling back the curtain on power structures most people never see. The world works in ways different from what we are told. Understanding the reality is the first step toward changing it.